Security was already standing behind my chair when Richard cleared his throat. "You have 10 minutes. Daisy," he said, sliding a single sheet of paper across the table. "We're eliminating your position. The board agrees we need someone more, aligned with our future direction. And frankly, your resistance to streamlining oversight has slowed innovation." Streamlining oversight. That was the official reason. The unofficial one was sitting 2 seats to his right. Evan Hallbrook, 24, fresh out of college with a degree in digital branding, and exactly 0 hours inside a regulatory review. He was already logged into my presentation screen. "Before I tell you what happened next, I'm curious, where are you listening from right now? What's the temperature like where you are? Drop it in the comments. I read everyone. And if stories like this matter to you, stories about accountability and quiet strength, consider subscribing. Your support doesn't just grow this channel, it helps these lessons reach someone who might need them today. I had spent 12 years as head of strategic compliance, building the risk control architecture that kept this company from collapsing under 3 separate federal inquiries. I designed the early warning audit triggers. I rewrote the reporting framework that saved us over $42 million in avoided penalties. When a supplier fraud scandal almost detonated our freight division, I was the one who stayed 72 straight hours to rebuild the documentation trail before regulators arrived. But today, I was resistant. Richard adjusted his cufflinks. Fresh blood beats outdated loyalty. Outdated loyalty. That's what he called a compliance officer who refused to remove audit checkpoints just because they were inconvenient. No one spoke. Not when my badge was deactivated mid-meeting. Not when Evan casually rotated my laptop toward himself like it had always belonged to him. Humiliation has a sound. It's quiet. It's the scrape of your own chair against polished flooring while executives avoid eye contact. "I understand," I said evenly. 9 minutes later, my office was empty. On the 10th, I left my access card on the desk. No protest, no performance. The elevator doors closed. I watched my reflection calm, controlled. When they opened in the lobby, my phone vibrated. Crestfall Capital. "Daisy," the managing partner said, voice steady. "We're acquiring a company with serious structural compliance failures. We need someone who knows how to prevent federal scrutiny before it happens. Would you consider building a system from the ground up?" I glanced back at the tower behind me. "Yes," I replied. "I'd love to rebuild something properly. What you're about to hear is a dramatized story. Created with AI assistance for storytelling and educational purposes, it isn't based on any specific person or organization. I hope it resonates with you. And if tonight's not the right time for it, that's okay too. Get some rest. Take care of yourself. And I'll see you in the next one." 6 months later, the experiment was in full swing. Evan Hallbrook announced that the internal audit process was bloated and anti-innovation. He eliminated 3 compliance checkpoints I had built, calling them redundant. According to him, speed mattered more than scrutiny. Richard proudly reposted the announcement on LinkedIn, bragging that he had modernized operational governance for a new era. The comments were full of applause emojis. None of them had ever sat across from a federal auditor, from a distance. I watched the dominoes begin to lean. I remembered the $18 million vendor deal I once blocked because a minor data discrepancy triggered my early warning system. The finance team had called me paranoid. 2 weeks later, we uncovered falsified shipping records and shell invoices. That paranoia saved the company from a public investigation. Now those early warning triggers were gone. Internal risk reports started surfacing missed disclosures, incomplete documentation, vendor irregularities. They were labeled low priority. Efficiency over caution. Then the quarterly audit failed. 17%. That's how much the company's stock dropped in 3 trading days after the auditors cited material weaknesses in oversight. Richard blamed market volatility. Evan blamed legacy resistance. Accountability was apparently obsolete too. Meanwhile, my career had taken a different direction. I was now Chief Operating Officer of a rapidly scaling logistics firm, up 280% year over year. Last week, We finalized the acquisition of a 51% stake in Richard's primary regional competitor, and restructuring, I've learned, is always easier from the inside. The letter arrived on a Tuesday morning, stamped with the seal no executive ever wants to see. The Securities and Exchange Commission had opened a formal inquiry into reporting discrepancies tied to the failed quarterly audit. The language was precise material weaknesses, potential misstatements, control deficiencies. I read every word without blinking. 6 months ago, I would have been the one coordinating the response, building the document trail, managing the regulator's access. Now I watched from a distance, quiet and composed. Richard reacted exactly as I expected. In an internal memo leaked to industry reporters, he cited accounting misinterpretations and blamed the finance team for procedural lapses. He called it a technical misunderstanding. Accountability, once again, traveled downward. Evan, the architect of streamlined oversight, stopped appearing in leadership meetings. His calendar went blank. Innovation, apparently, had scheduling conflicts. I didn't intervene. I didn't call anyone. I didn't send a warning. But I remembered something Richard had forgotten. When I built the compliance framework 12 years earlier, I embedded a non-negotiable log retention clause. All system overrides, audit modifications, and approval changes were automatically archived for 24 months in an encrypted backup environment. It wasn't dramatic, it was procedural. Quiet safeguards rarely make headlines. During the Nephew experiment, 3 of my eliminated checkpoints required formal override signatures. Those overrides were logged, time-stamped, attributed, from my office as COO of a different company. I reviewed public filings and waited. The investigation widened. Shareholder attorneys began circling. Richard gave interviews insisting the controls had been simplified responsibly. Simplified. Power doesn't always announce itself. Sometimes it waits for the right recipient. 2 weeks after the inquiry began, the board of directors received an anonymous package. No return address. Inside a secure digital copy of archived system logs detailing who authorized the removal of compliance checkpoints and when. Not commentary, not accusation, just data. I didn't confirm anything. I didn't need to. Silence, I've learned, can carry far more weight than confrontation. By the time the board called the emergency meeting, the tension had already turned visible. Share prices were unstable, reporters were circling, and the SEC inquiry was no longer a rumor, it was a liability. The directors summoned Richard to headquarters under the pretense of a strategic review. I wasn't in the room, but I heard enough from people who were. He walked in defensive. He walked out exposed. This is sabotage, he reportedly said when confronted with the archived override logs. Someone is targeting leadership decisions. His voice, I was told, carried more heat than certainty. The board wasn't debating innovation anymore. They were questioning judgment. 3 removed checkpoints, direct override signatures, time-stamped approvals. His approvals. Confrontation changes posture. It sharpens silence. That same week, I received a formal call from the board's legal committee, not as a former employee, as an external compliance authority. My current company had just finalized acquisition terms to support a broader restructuring strategy in the sector. They needed an independent advisor to evaluate operational exposure before moving forward with integration. I agreed. Richard didn't know. The irony was almost surgical. 6 months earlier, I had 10 minutes to clear my desk. Now, I was reviewing the structural integrity of the organization he still claimed to control. The first phase of restructuring required a comprehensive executive risk assessment, governance stability, leadership accountability, exposure to regulatory penalties. It was procedural, not personal. Every senior executive would undergo review before final merger approval. I signed the advisory contract without hesitation. Buried in that contract standard language in complex acquisitions was a clause granting the independent compliance advisor authority to recommend executive retention or removal based on risk findings. In plain terms, I would evaluate senior leadership suitability post-merger, including his. I didn't announce it. I didn't hint at it. Power rarely needs introduction. Richard was still giving interviews about modernization, while the board quietly prepared contingency plans. The revolt wasn't loud. It was procedural. And procedures, unlike speeches, are binding. If you believe he should step down from that chair, drop a 1 in the comments. Your voice matters more than you think, because accountability begins when people are willing to say it out loud. Richard Holbrook officially resigned on a Friday afternoon, citing personal reasons and a desire to explore new opportunities. By Monday morning, industry headlines had translated that into what it really was: forced removal under regulatory pressure. I read the announcement between back-to-back operations meetings and felt nothing dramatic, just a quiet, clinical sense of symmetry. 2 weeks later, his name appeared in our internal hiring system. I almost missed it. Applicant Richard Holbrook, position Operations Associate, compensation $17 per hour. Our company had been expanding aggressively after the recent acquisition, absorbing regional facilities and restructuring workflow. Entry-level operations associates handled scheduling, vendor confirmations, and documentation compliance, the kind of groundwork that requires patience, accuracy, and humility. I opened his resume. It was immaculate in formatting, confident in tone. Former Senior Operations Director, 2 decades of executive leadership, oversaw modernization initiatives, drove innovation. Then I reached the summary line: experienced leadership in crisis management. I paused. Crisis management. That was one way to describe losing 17% of shareholder value and triggering a federal inquiry. The phrasing was almost elegant in its restraint. No mention of override logs, no reference to eliminated checkpoints, just leadership. Cold irony has a particular flavor. It doesn't burn, it clarifies. From a purely procedural standpoint, there was no reason to reject the application immediately. Our hiring framework required that qualified candidates, even overqualified ones, move through initial screening. HR had flagged his submission as unusual but technically eligible. I considered the operational optics. A former executive reporting to mid-level supervisors, handling hourly metrics, submitting timesheets. The system required a next step, so I added one. I left a note in the applicant review portal: schedule in-person interview. Executive oversight recommended. HR responded within the hour. Assuming I wanted to assess reputational risk, they were correct. I didn't notify him personally. I didn't adjust the salary range. $17 per hour remained fixed by the end of the day. The interview calendar reflected his name. Time slot confirmed. There's a difference between revenge and process. This wasn't emotional. It was structural. And structures, when built correctly, always cycle back. The interview room was intentionally ordinary. Neutral walls, glass panel, a single folder placed at the center of the table. I arrived early and sat facing the door. Not for intimidation, but for clarity. Structure matters. When Richard stepped inside, he stopped mid-stride, for a brief second. He didn't mask it. His face drained of color. Surprise. Then calculation. Then something close to resentment. He recovered quickly. Executives are trained for composure. Daisy, he said carefully, I wasn't aware you'd be conducting this. I oversee final reviews. I replied evenly. Please. Have a seat. He did, though not comfortably. This is personal, he added, lowering his voice as if that might reframe the dynamic. I folded my hands. No. Richard, this is structural. Silence settled between us, the kind that measures power shifts. I began with standard protocol: employment history, scope of responsibility, crisis response examples. He spoke in polished summaries: strategic pivots, modernization efforts, transitional challenges. The language was refined, detached. Then I adjusted the angle. Describe your accountability framework when eliminating compliance checkpoints. I asked. A flicker crossed his expression. We streamlined redundant processes. He said. The organization required agility. That wasn't my question. I replied, "What accountability safeguards replaced the removed controls?" He paused. There are moments when absence speaks louder than confession. His resume claimed expertise in crisis management, yet he couldn't articulate the preventive architecture that would have avoided one. "I trusted my team," he said finally. "Trust isn't a framework." I answered. I opened the folder in front of me and slid a document across the table. Internal audit override logs, timestamps, authorization signatures. His name, clearly marked beside 3 removed compliance triggers. He stared at it. The room felt smaller. "This was operational discretion," he said. Though the confidence had thinned, it was documented exposure. I corrected. The interview had shifted. It was no longer about qualifications for a $17 per hour role. It was about understanding the weight of decisions. I closed the folder. "Thank you for your time." "Richard," I said calmly, "we'll be in touch. Power doesn't need volume, it only needs record. Consequences rarely arrive all at once. They expand outward, quietly at first, then all at once." The investigation that had once been confined to boardrooms and legal memos moved into headlines. Financial journals reported systemic compliance failures. Business networks replayed archived interviews where Richard had praised streamlined oversight. Analysts dissected timelines. The narrative shifted from unfortunate audit results to executive negligence. Within weeks, a shareholder class action lawsuit was filed, alleging breach of fiduciary duty and material misrepresentation. The complaint cited override logs and public statements that contradicted internal records. Market confidence thinned, credit terms tightened, vendors demanded reassurances in writing. Evain did not fare better. The regulatory review concluded that he had exercised financial oversight without sufficient credentials during a reporting period under inquiry. The state licensing board imposed a 3-year prohibition on serving in any financial management capacity. Innovation had consequences. Richard requested a meeting. Not an interview, not a formal appeal, a private discussion. We met in a neutral office suite downtown. He arrived composed, but visibly worn, the kind of fatigue that follows prolonged public scrutiny. "You've made your point," he said without preamble. "This has gone far enough." "I haven't made anything," I replied evenly. "Public records did." He leaned forward. "There's room for compromise. I can step back quietly. You don't need to keep escalating this. Escalation implies intent. What unfolded was sequence. The lawsuit isn't mine," I said. "The investigation isn't mine. They followed documentation." He hesitated, then tried a different angle. "What do you want?" That question lingered between us longer than he expected. "I want structure." I answered, "Stability." His eyes narrowed. "You're positioning yourself." I allowed a small pause before responding. "When the stock collapsed," I said calmly, "I purchased your divested shares through a holding vehicle at roughly 1/10 of their previous value." Silence. "You're a shareholder now," he said slowly. "Majority aligned." I corrected. The expansion of consequence had come full circle. Public record, market reaction, structural realignment. Nothing personal, just arithmetic. Desperation changes a man's tone before it changes his strategy. Richard asked for another meeting, this time in my office. Not neutral ground, mine. He didn't wait for small talk. "I can still be useful," he said, sitting forward as if proximity might rebuild authority. "You know how these things work. Corporate pressure, board expectations, market demands, decisions get made in context. Context. It was the first time he'd acknowledged that decisions had, in fact, been made. "You eliminated oversight checkpoints," I replied calmly. "That wasn't market pressure. That was authorization." He exhaled sharply. "The board wanted faster reporting cycles. They wanted growth optics. I adapted." Adapted, a generous word for bypassing compliance controls with documented override signatures. "I trusted the signals," he continued. The risk seemed manageable. I let the silence stretch. Silence forces ownership where argument invites deflection. You're restructuring the sector, he said finally. You don't want this turning into a public execution. Let me advise quietly. I understand the network. I can stabilize relationships. The offer wasn't emotional, it was transactional. From a purely strategic standpoint, absorbing a former executive as a consultant might have reduced friction. It would have looked merciful, efficient. But structure isn't built on convenience. You're asking for insulation, I said, not contribution. His jaw tightened. You think your immune pressure will come for you too. It already has. I answered evenly. Earlier that morning, our legal department finalized its internal review of the shareholder lawsuit filings and supporting documentation. The conclusion was precise and unambiguous. The removal of compliance checkpoints without documented compensatory controls constituted a potential breach of fiduciary duty. Personal liability exposure was no longer theoretical. I slid a summary memo across the desk. This isn't about optics anymore, I said. It's about duty. He scanned the page, eyes slowing at the phrase individual accountability. They can't pursue that. He muttered. They can, I replied. And they likely will, for the first time since he walked in. He didn't argue. Desperation had reached its structural limit. The decision required only one signature. Richard's application had completed every procedural step: background review, eligibility verification, internal assessment. HR waited for my final authorization. The form was simple, almost impersonal. Candidate status pending executive approval. I read it once more, not out of doubt, but out of discipline. For years, I had insisted that compliance was not emotional, it was structural. Fair processes protect organizations from bias. That principle applied here as much as it ever had. I signed the rejection, reason for decision, insufficient professional judgment. The wording was precise, not vindictive, not dramatic. Judgment is measurable in documented actions. Override signatures, eliminated safeguards, ignored escalation reports. It was the same standard I would apply to any candidate entrusted with operational responsibility. HR notified him within the hour. He arrived in the lobby unexpectedly that afternoon, requesting clarification. Security followed protocol and informed him that the decision was final. There was no appeal mechanism for entry-level roles beyond executive review, and executive review had already occurred. I watched discreetly from the upper-level corridor. He stood still for a moment after hearing the confirmation. Not angry, not shouting, just still. A man who had once commanded conference rooms now facing a glass door that would not open for him. Opportunity doesn't disappear loudly, it closes quietly. He left the building without looking back. The structural sequence was complete. Application submitted, evaluation conducted, decision rendered, process upheld. Later that week, the board convened to finalize the post-restructuring governance framework. Regulatory exposure had stabilized. Investor confidence was gradually returning. The acquisition strategy had integrated successfully. The company required permanent leadership to guide the next phase. They voted unanimously. I did not campaign for the position. I did not request it. I accepted it. Chair of Executive Operations. The announcement cited experience in compliance architecture, crisis prevention, and structural reform. The same expertise once labeled outdated loyalty had become institutional necessity. Controlled escalation is not explosive. It is cumulative. Richard lost his final opportunity through documented choices. I stepped into expanded authority through documented results. In the end, there was no dramatic confrontation, no triumphant speech, just structure restored. And this time, I was the one signing. I stood in the office that used to belong to Richard Holbrook and felt nothing theatrical. The desk was the same polished walnut. The skyline beyond the glass hadn't changed. What changed was the authority behind the signature line. I didn't sit down to celebrate. I opened a laptop and reviewed the compliance reinstatement plan. The first order of business was structural restoration. We rebuilt the oversight checkpoints that had been eliminated. We reinstated automated escalation triggers and required dual authorization protocols for material reporting adjustments. Every override now required documented compensatory controls. No shortcuts. No modernization slogans. Stability returned gradually, not dramatically. Within 8 months, the company's stock recovered 32% of the lost value. Investor calls shifted from damage control to measured growth forecasts. Vendors extended favorable terms again. Regulators closed the inquiry with corrective actions implemented and verified. Evan pivoted careers. Public filings listed him in a marketing role at a small startup unrelated to financial management. Innovation redirected. Richard listed himself as an independent consultant. Industry contacts told me inquiries were sparse. Reputation is difficult to rebuild once documentation contradicts narrative. I kept the office minimal. No awards on the wall. No framed headlines. Justice, when it's structural, doesn't require applause. One afternoon, a hiring manager asked whether to consider a candidate with impressive credentials but weak compliance history. I reviewed the file and handed it back. We don't hire amateurs. What this taught me wasn't about revenge. It was about structure. Titles can be taken in 10 minutes. Reputation can be questioned in one meeting. But the systems you build, the discipline you practice, and the integrity you document, those stay. I didn't win because I fought louder. I won because I kept records, stayed calm, and let consequences follow logic. That's not dramatic. It's durable. If you were in that room, given 10 minutes to disappear, what would you protect first, your pride or your proof? That's not a rhetorical question. I'd genuinely like to know where you're listening from and what you would have done differently. Stories like this aren't just entertainment. They remind people that quiet strength matters, that documentation matters, that patience can outlast power. If this resonated with you, consider subscribing. One click from you helps this story reach someone who might be doubting their own resilience right now. Leave a comment, share your perspective. Hit like not for me, but for the person who needs to hear that integrity still has leverage. This story was fully created and produced by our team. We do not copy or borrow content from any other channel. Thank you for staying with us and listening until the end.